have our first guest speaker, which is Dimo Dimov, Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Bath. Together with Dimo, we had co-organized a couple of sessions in the academic world related to future making with different perspective. We welcome this evening Dimo among us to give us a few philosophical, you will see, inspirations about future making. I'm very much looking forward to this session and this moment. And I will just remind you that if you have any question, doubts, or things that you want to ask to Dimo, feel free to use our poll, which is a way through which we will collect questions, Dimo, and then we will, in the conversation at the end, Silvia is gonna give you those curiosities that our guests and listeners might have on your session. So I will leave directly the floor to you and also the possibility to share your screen. So now I just unscreen my slides and I leave the floor to you. Yeah, we can see the slides and I think we can also hear you. Thank you, Dimo, for being with us.
This is great. Thank you, Stefano and Claudio, for inviting me. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be with you, albeit virtually. Wish I was somehow with you in person in Italy, but I will have to do with the rainy and cloudy weather in the UK at the moment. So very pleased to share with you some perspectives on the future. I love the topic of the future, and as you can see from the title of my brief talk today, I want to promote the idea. We always think about the future as something that is out there. And when we try to find or anticipate it, we tend to look outwards in anticipating what will happen. But if I were to leave with one idea today, this will be something along the lines that if we're looking for the future, we're probably best placed to find it within ourselves. And I'll try to clarify that in a moment. So let me just start out by making the point that I think the idea of the future is one of the greatest human inventions. And I say that it is an invention because it comes on the back of, our brains have evolved to begin to anticipate ahead in time. And at some point, we begin to realize that when we try to anticipate in time, this becomes a space, call it a virtual space, in which we can begin to project our hopes, our aspirations, and some of the, basically our imagination. And one of the things that we realize is that we can imagine things, but then we can act. And when we do act, some of the things that we imagine can actually become real. And in this lies a great power. So if we begin to think about the future as this space, and I don't even know how to describe it, call it a virtual space, because it is virtual in a way, we begin to make these projections, it becomes an area into which we can begin to speculate. We can begin to speculate what the future is. We can begin to share ideas about what we want the future to be. This allows us to, align our imaginations, coordinate our projects, and begin to take action together to make some of that future real. And of course, in the area of business and even financial markets, the future then becomes an area into which we can actively begin to speculate. And what financial markets are, if you think about it, it's a way of making bets on the future. We're betting about which ideas or which projections the future are going to prevail. And this is of course very interesting. On the back of that idea of the future as a realm in which we can project things, some interesting things begin to happen. The whole idea of money gets born out of that idea of perpetuating or pushing things into the future. In fact, we know that from some of the early money actually came out of Italy, some of the early Italian states, and this is when transactions between people and debts with banks, they can be extended towards the future, and that creates money. It's not before long we have financial markets and this ability to speculate into this thing called future. So without further ado, let me just to try to think and illustrate some of the ways in which we have speculated about the future. And I just want to pick out certain examples and see what is it that we can learn from them. So as you can see, the pictures on the screen, if I go through them. In the top left, we have, this is IBM in the 1940s, when the CEO of IBM famously forecasted that there will be a global demand of perhaps 5 computers. This is what the IBM, what computers used to be at the time. They were a big collection of vacuum tubes, and they would be the size of a room. Then we have from the 80s, early 80s, there were some screen-based computing. And these were ventures that famously did not go anywhere. There was the potential was not quite there. This idea of interactive screens, and of course, just 40 years later, this is what we do on a day-to-day basis. Then we have in the lower left, we have the first photocopier. This was the 914 model by Xerox. They invented it. They didn't know quite what to do with it. They hired a consulting company called Arthur D. Little to do a market study about the potential of the photocopier. And Arthur D. Little came out with a report that said there is no market potential for the photocopier, and therefore they recommended that this not be commercialized. What Xerox did is they put it out, and before long this transformed the way Office worked, and all of a sudden turned out we do a lot of photocopying, and of course now we're at the other end of that, and we're phasing out paper. Then in the next image, we have the first digital camera. This was the invention of Steve Sasson at Kodak. And as you can see, it's quite a heavy device. It would probably be almost half the size of me. This has a capacity of 100 pixels at the beginning. And this was invented at Kodak, and Kodak didn't see much potential for digital cameras, and they did not commercialize it. They did not take advantage of it. And that eventually led to the demise of Kodak, who were focused on film. And then, of course, we have on the right-hand side, we have one of the most famous magazine covers. This is Ford magazine in 2007, and that's the year that the iPhone came out. And this was the cover of the magazine with the Nokia CEO on the cover. Nokia 1 billion customers and counting. Can anyone catch them? And of course, as we know, in retrospect, many did. So the question, when we look at these attempts to make predictions about how things are going to turn out, when we speak to managers and we try to draw lessons from these experiences, the two things that usually come, what managers will say is actually the problem with all these scenarios is that people couldn't quite predict, because there was a problem of not enough data, and there was a problem of not good enough models. So they would say, we need more data, we need better models to be able to make these predictions. And if we solve that problem, then somehow we'll be able to capture the future, so to speak, and sense which way people are, which way things are going to evolve. But of course, the issue has nothing to do with data or with models, but it's a simple idea that what the future is, if you think of it, it's a bit like the horizon. It's always something that is ahead of us, and it becomes something that is continuously transformed because of our ability to do things and expand our knowledge. So I've picked up here Escher's famous painting called Drawing Hands. And this is this idea that we want to know in order to do, but often we do in order to know. And by doing things, we expand our knowledge, and our knowledge enables us to do yet more things on the basis of which we know more, and we do more, and we know more. And this is a recursive relationship that we forever expand, the possibilities of the future. So it's not something that we can actually capture in that sense. If I switch then to the moment about the area of business, this is another one of my favorite quotes in this space, and this is from a prominent venture capitalist. And venture capitalists are, they could probably be the best example of people who try to make money out of a future that turns out in a particular way. This is their business, to anticipate groundbreaking inventions with the possibility to transform things. But what his reflections suggest, and this is Mark Andreessen, is of Andreessen Horowitz, and he of course was the inventor of the first web browser, Netscape. He reflects on his experience as a venture capitalist, and he says, but it turns out that we have made all our money, he would say, on what he would describe successful investment. Of course, an investment needs to succeed to be able to make money, but all of their all of their successes to be able to make the money that they were looking for, to achieve the returns that they're looking for. In all of these cases, these investments have been what he calls non-consensus. And non-consensus, it says, if we translate it into practical terms, is that these are things that when we invest in initially, they're just plain crazy. So investing in things that it makes no sense, and we cannot see any sense why this would ever work out. And he's famous then that what he actually says, and this is the little 2x2 that Mark Anderson has prepared, where he would divide investments into 4 categories. On the horizontal space, we can divide them on the basis of whether they've been success or failure. And on the vertical, we divide them on the basis of whether they were consensus or non-consensus. And that gives us a nice 2x2. And if we put labels into these categories, then if we succeed in the consensus area, we would get what people would call, economists would call, a normal return. If we succeed in a non-consensus area, this is the source of what we would call abnormal returns. And these are the kind of returns that some investors are after. And then equally, if we fail in a consensus space, we would call that abnormal failure. It would be unexpected in many ways. But failing in a non-consensus space, of course, that would be a normal failure, because trying to do crazy things, most of the times, these would not work out. So if we try to reflect on that little 2x2, it actually turns out, and this is, I've extended it a bit when I take it to the next slide. It turns out that there's a certain way that we can divide the space, and if I talk you through with it. But first of all, vertically, this is the line of time. We can never know in advance whether something would succeed or fail. So in that sense, success and failure are 2 categories that, from the point of view of the present, are contained into what we might consider possible. So time is what divides the actual, or what has happened, from what is possible, what lies in the future. And at the time that we make decisions, we try to make bets on the future, so to speak, we cannot know whether things are going to succeed or fail. So we have to live with the fact that both of these outcomes are possible. Where we do have a choice, and this is what I have in that column, that is the futures that we see, that's the vertical division between the area, and that's separated by what we know and what we might consider reasonable or unreasonable. So in terms of knowledge, we can divide space in terms of things that we would say, these are things that are reasonable based on what we know. And there's certain things that, based on what we know, we would consider unreasonable. So the choice we have is whether we want to play in the reasonable space or in the unreasonable space. And once we've made that choice, once we've decided what type of futures we want to see, then we get to experience the futures that we get. And on the reasonable side, we get either something that is incremental, something that would generate a normal return, that would be an incremental innovation, or we will get a negative surprise in the case that the things don't work out. And in the unreasonable space, we could get something that's transformative, something that in an unexpected way changes and disrupts or transforms the way we live. Or in the most cases of normal failure, so to speak, we would get to experience what I would call the dignity of striving, or a well-intentioned failure. We've tried to pursue imaginary, let's call them crazy projects. Sometimes they don't work out, but of course, they can be quite a lot of a source of learning. So this is this interplay between the futures that we seek and the futures that we get. And we get to choose whether to be reasonable or unreasonable. And of course, with that come the consequences of the kind of futures that we might get. So if I now shift gears to someone else, and that's George Bernard Shaw. He is a playwright, and you will see that idea of reasonable and unreasonable resonates quite well with one of his famous quotes. And this is this idea that the reasonable person tries to adapt themselves to the world. The unreasonable person tries to do, well, the crazy thing, which is try to adapt the world to themselves. And therefore, George Bernard Shaw would say, progress depends on the unreasonable person. So again, we have this interplay between reason and unreason. And if we try to get the boundary between the two, it gives us this image of what I would call the edge of reason. And the edge of reason is this space that we might look out into the future, imagine certain things and say, well, certain things are quite crazy, they're unreasonable. They would lie beyond the edge of reason. Of course, if we try to imagine what is it like to step beyond the edge of reason, and of course, if we think about the edge, and I put the picture of the cliff here, it is unlike stepping off a cliff where we fall and disappear. If you think about what does it take, what happens when we step beyond the edge of reason, what in fact happens is this is how we get surprise. When we step beyond the edge, this is where we open ourselves to surprise. That's what it means to step beyond the edge of reason. And the question then arises, where does this surprise come from, and how can we make sense of that? And I'll try to share some more ideas on that. I love quotes. I like to quote quotes in different ways. And so, if we think about where does what is the source of unreason, I might say that imagination is probably the biggest source of unreason. And Lewis Carroll's famous sense that imagination is the only weapon in the world against reality. It's our ability to imagine things differently, and very often vastly differently, that is often against that very imagination that we begin to see our present situation as problematic in some sense. We don't realize that we have a problem unless we imagine, and until we imagine that things could be different. And of course, we shouldn't forget, I immediately counterbalance that with another philosopher, Mike Tyson, who would say, no, simply imagining something is not enough to make it so. And this is where the idea of everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. So imagination is not enough, but imagination is a starting point. What more can we say about imagination? And why is it that some things that we imagine seem crazy, or why is it that not everybody is willing to indulge imagination, so to speak? This arises from a couple of things. The first one is what I would call the imagination gap, and this comes from the fact that imagination actually requires quite a bit of effort. We know from neuroscience, we know from people who study brains and how our memory works, we know that what we imagine is usually sourced from memory. In fact, the brain uses the same area where we store memories. The same area is used to imagine, to make the projections that constitute our imaginations. And because of that, it means that normally imagination would work out of habit. When we try to imagine, we imagine things that we're used to, that work out quite habitual. So therefore, we imagine things that we've experienced, and it is very hard to rise above that, to go beyond our experience, to imagine things in a vastly different way. Of course, in the area of generative AI, this has become, it seems to be becoming easier. Because one of the things that Gen AI models are very good at is hallucination. And of course, our whole idea of imagination and even consciousness, some neuroscientists will call that controlled hallucination. So we're very good at hallucinating. It is just that our habits are very often preventing us from indulging a little bit more in that hallucination. So it is hard to imagine details. When we imagine something, it's very hard to imagine details. And because of that, so I got a little pop-up. And because of that, we have to work hard to rise above and to work out on the details. The second implication is that we ignore what we cannot imagine. So as a consequence, the things that we imagine tend to be blurry, with not a lot of detail, and very difficult to describe them, very difficult to inspire people around them. And this is why very often when we put together two projects side by side, one very imaginative and different, and the other one very familiar and incremental, it's usually the more familiar one that gets the details, gets the facts, and is able to gather more support. So imagination requires quite a bit of effort. The second difficulty around it comes from what I would call the time trap. And this is, it has to do with the fact that it's very difficult. In fact, when we imagine the future, we see our present selves in the future. And therefore, it is very difficult to anticipate how we will change and therefore how we will value things differently in the future. And because of that, we tend to judge the future from where we are at present and some of the values that we have. So what can we make of these two difficulties around imagination? Well, when it comes to this idea of preparing for the future or aspiring and being ambitious in trying to pursue something that's very different from where we are, this is what I would call gearing up for the future. And this is another 2x2 that I would share with you. If we think about aspirations, and that's the vertical dimension in this space, our aspiration can vary between our being just fulfilled. We're happy with the way things are, and we don't necessarily think that they need to be different. So we're very happy. So we're fulfilled. Or we can also be very ambitious in aspiring for something that is very different. So ambition is one thing that opens up this particular dimension. But the horizontal dimension would tell us that if we're ambitious and we rely simply on habit, on the way our thinking or the way our the ways of engaging in the world is simply based on the way things have become habitual for us, then if we simply rely on habit, then trying to do transformative things or ambitious things out of habit can lead to quite a lot of overheating, because we're unable out of habit to deal with some of the uncertainties that more transformative future requires. So the path for development is alongside what I would call meta skills. These are skills of reflection, learning, and these are ways for us to rise above habit and become what I might call kinetic in the way that we think. And that requires developing new ways of thinking to rise above our habits. And this is a way of ensuring that we flourish when we try to pursue more transformative futures, but now equipped with diverse and better ways of thinking. How does that fit to try to tie this all together? Let me give you another. I'm aware I'm putting a lot of models here, but hopefully some of these are going to resonate. And this is where the idea of meta skill comes in. And if we reflect for a moment about things that you do or things that we do, whenever we try to solve problems, we do things, we take action, and this would happen at a level that I would call an operational tier, that we see the problem and we have a sense of what we need to do. So we can do that is out of instinct, out of experience. This is where habit operates in that operational theory. If we try to think about what we do, then we can engage in something that we might call action planning, to form intentions, to do different things. And by virtue of these intentions, we exercise cognitive control over what we do. If we try and think even deeper about where does our action planning come from, that would come from a certain logic, and that logic will come from a way of reasoning, and that's a way of exercising metacognitive control about how we form intention. We can go even higher and think, but where does our reasoning come from? But that comes from a certain way of viewing the world, and that comes with values and various ways of being and working together. This is a way of exercising normative control about the logic that we use. And even then, if you go even further and say, well, where does that framing come from? The way we see the world, we might say that this would come from our ability to envision and to think about the future in a certain way. And it's thinking about the future that allows us to exercise what I would call perspective control over the way we see the world, in turn normative control, in turn metacognitive, in turn cognitive. So this hierarchy is one that is very imaginary. To be able to go up the hierarchy is where we need to be able to be very reflective and begin to think about how we think. The less we do that, the more we operate at the level of the operational tier. In other words, the more we operate out of habit. So this idea of meta skills has to do with our ability to begin to reflect and say, where do our intentions come from? Where does our logic come from? Where does our framing of the world come from? And what is the implicit idea of a future that we have in the things that we do? So in gearing up to closing this, I just wanted to leave you away with some of the tools that we've developed to try and develop this more reflective mode of thinking, or begin to think about the way we think. And this is work that comes on this idea of habit as a style of thinking. And so to think about what that means is that in any moment of engaging with the world, we see things in a particular way, we do things as a result, and things happen. And so impact, and that gives us a feedback loop, and we're, gives us an ability to take that new data and do this again. So this is a very simple recursive model. We see things, we do things, and things happen. But what we see and what we do are actually things that are regulated, but what I would call a thinking style. So this is a way we organize our thinking. And when thinking style is something that arises out of habit, it becomes something that we never see. It becomes something that we never experience. We're simply in the world, and we see and we do. But the more we begin to think about why we see things in a certain way, why we do things in a certain way, this is where reflection comes. And on the question of seeing, in any situation, we can ask questions related to looking at what is there, or asking questions about what's not there. So a way of seeing is also our ability to imagine what's not there. That's also a way of seeing. When it comes to doing, we can take the attitude of asking the question of why we should do certain things. So that requires a justification. But we can also ask the question, why not? And this is a way of doing, which is more playful in nature. So we take that simple idea of seeing and doing as things that we could, in theory, control. Think of them as two imaginary levers. That gives us a way of understanding how we see and how we do in the world as levers that we can move to some imaginary positions. So in the question of seeing, what we see is we might see structure, we might see the world as it is, and we try to fit things and new information within that structure. We would ignore certain information as irrelevant. But we can also be open in how we see, where we can begin to engage with new information and new data in an imaginary way, to try to think about what is this the beginning of? What is that is not there yet? So that's the idea of openness and seeing. And on the side of doing, we can be very focused on reason, and that's coming back to the reasonable versus unreasonable early on. And when we rely on reason, the question is, we try to justify what we do, and the justification is usually on the basis of what is it we're trying to achieve. But we can also be playful in what we do, and that's when we do things for no reason. We just want to see what happens. And so playful is a very powerful instrument for discovering new and interesting things, and for opening ourselves up for surprises. And so when we put these two levers together, that gives us that we can actually we begin to understand ourselves or our habits as being located in one of these four types or four styles of thinking. We could be focused thinkers, playful, incremental, or breakaway. And understanding our style is a way of understanding what our habits of thinking are. And it becomes the first step in realizing that we can begin to expand our thinking into the full range within that matrix. And I've put the address there if you want to check this out, and if you can even look at your own style. We have a short 5-minute assessment that can give you the feedback. You can see that on the link there. So the point I want to take you away is when we begin, we start being reflective, when we engage in metacognition, we can begin to engage in situations and think about, move beyond our default way of responding to a situation to becoming more kinetic. And that's the idea that once we understand, we begin to think about how we think, thinking becomes a choice that we can exercise in engaging in the situation. So we move from a habit, thinking is something habitual, to thinking that we can deliberately engage in, and we can engage in all these different styles. So to close things full circle, I want to leave you with another quote. This is from the 1964 Nobel Prize acceptance speech by Martin Luther King. And he that's a pull loop back to the title of my talk. He made the observation that we live in two realms. There's the realm of the internal, and this is the realm of our hopes, our aspirations, our values, in our spiritual life. But there's also the realm of the external, which is everything that is outside, technology, processes, things out there in the world. And he made the observation, and this is very interesting, that was done 60 years ago. And even back then, this was what is always a problem, that we have allowed the internal to become lost in the external. In other words, we have allowed the means by which we live to outdistance the ends for which we live. And so this idea of finding the future within is a way of re-engaging with our hopes, with our aspirations, with our values, trying to determine what are the ends that we want to achieve and use that as a basis for pursuing and transforming things to get to the future that we want. And that future we find within and not without. So thank you very much.